Without further ado, Heather, Dina, over to you.
Everyone. I'd like to start first by thanking Janet for inviting Dina and me to speak with you all today. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm working remotely, but that the Davis is located on the ancestral and unceded tribal lands of the Massachusetts people, and that we acknowledge the continuing presence of the Massachusetts and the relatives and neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples, and pay respect to Indigenous elders past and present. I'd also love to give a little bit of context for our talk today. I've been working at the Davis for just over a year, and so most of my and Dina's Davis experiences have been from home. While we haven't been able to welcome students to the museum physically, the Davis curators have worked to bring the collection to students virtually through guest teaching, virtual exhibitions, and programs like the January Project, which is where I first delivered the talk I'm about to give today. A little caveat about me, while my personal research expertise is in Northern European art from the 16th and 17th centuries, which you'll see a bit of today, I also get to teach with works from all periods, developing ways that our diverse collections can intersect with the college's interdisciplinary curriculum. So today, I will start sharing my screen. Let's see. Okay. Okay. So today we'll be looking at works of art responding to 4 different infectious diseases: bubonic plague, syphilis, cholera, and HIV/AIDS. As we go along, we'll discover that such art can serve a range of functions, whether it's made as a form of protection, as a warning, or as a form of advocacy. Start here. I will mention, I'm going to start. The image you'll see here is not at the Davis collections, but I try to be clear throughout when something is in the Davis Museum and when it's not. So just keep an eye out for that. Okay, so the epidemic that has probably had the greatest impact on the course of history was caused by bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is a bacterial infection transmitted by fleas to small mammals and humans. When infected, people develop painful swellings of the lymph nodes, known as buboes, which is where the disease gets its name. As the buboes swell and turn black, they rot the surrounding tissue, leading to very painful deaths. The plague made its first widespread appearance in the 6th century, but its second outbreak in 1347 was the most devastating. The 14th century plague epidemic, now referred to as the Black Death, wiped out between 30 and 60% of Europe's population within its first 6 years. While the 14th century Black Death was the most devastating plague outbreak, smaller outbreaks continued to occur intermittently until the 18th century. While the Davis doesn't have any objects that contain literal representations of the plague itself or the symptoms, we do have some works that speak to the religious response to the horrors of this disease. The painting on the left portrays a Sacra Conversazione, or Holy Conversation, depicting from left to right Joseph, Mary, Jesus, Saint Catherine, and Saint Sebastian. In the foreground, we see the donor who commissioned the painting, likely as a gift to a church or other religious institution. The drawing on the right depicts Saint Sebastian, bowled over in pain after being struck by arrows. According to tradition, Sebastian had been targeted by the armies of 3rd century Roman Emperor Diocletian during his persecution of early Christians. The drawing was likely a preparatory study for a painting depicting the wounded Saint Sebastian being tended by Irene, who nursed him back to health. I'm showing here an example of that subject. This painting that was at the Oberlin Museum, the Oberlin Allen Museum. Centuries after his martyrdom, a legend arose that Sebastian helped the Italian cities of Pavia and Rome overcome the first plague epidemic by interceding with God on behalf of the sick, which is visualized here in the Walter's altarpiece that I showed at the beginning. Just to point out, here's Saint Sebastian up at the top, begging on behalf of the people there. From that point on, images of Saint Sebastian were commissioned in greater numbers, especially during outbreaks. We suspect that the 2 Davis works had been commissioned under those conditions, especially since they were created by Venetian artists. As a thriving port city, Venice was especially vulnerable to outbreaks spread by infected rodents arriving on ships from overseas. Images like these would have served as either a call to Sebastian for protection against the plague or as an expression of gratitude for surviving it. Paintings focusing on his martyrdom also provided a model for dignified suffering, while those that included Irene nursing him back to health encouraged people to treat the infected with empathy and love rather than fear. As we have seen over the past year, frontline healthcare workers often take on enormous risks to treat those with infectious diseases. During the Renaissance, this was true also for those caring for people with bubonic plague. The engraving shown here is a memorial to the Dutch physician Peter Hogerbeets. Hogerbeets died from the plague while treating patients during a 16th century outbreak in Hoorn, which, like Venice, was a wealthy port city in the Netherlands. The portrait was commissioned by calligrapher Jacob Braze, who dedicated the print to Hoorn City Council in a poem written in his own beautiful calligraphic hand. The dedication extols Hogerbeets' selfless acts as a doctor. But the visual program actually pays tribute to Hogerbeets' two vocations, poetry and medicine. To the left of the doctor stands Apollo with a lyre as the patron god of poetry. And to the right stands the Roman god of medicine, Asclepius, while holding a serpent-entwined staff, a symbol we continue to associate with the medical profession. By the way, those of you who've ever wondered where the phrase Renaissance man comes from, this is a perfect example, somebody who was both a physician and a poet and known for both of them in his own time. So beneath those two gods, we have figures that are two putti. The Puto on the right sits on a skull and blows bubbles, symbolizing the transience of life and the ever-present threat of death. The Puto on the left, however, suggests that the memory of Hogerbeets' deeds will outlive him. This Puto holds a laurel wreath and a palm, which symbolize eternal fame. In an age of recurring epidemics, skulls and skeletons are common motifs throughout Renaissance art in the thematic category known as memento mori. Memento mori is Latin for remember you will die, which in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance conveyed the idea that everyone will eventually die, no matter how rich or poor someone is. Death is the great equalizer, so it is important to live a good and holy life. Memento mori images often show people in the prime of their lives, young military officers, young couples, and especially young, beautiful women. In the Dürer image on the left, a personification of death here in the background leers at a young couple from behind a tree holding an hourglass. On the right, death takes on the guise of a court jester taunting a young woman. The inscription above them reads, "Death abolishes all human beauty." Actually, I'm going to stand here for a second. Another reason we may see death paired with couples, and especially young women in the early 1500s, is because of another disease that arrived at just about the same time, the sexually transmitted infection syphilis. While historians debate furiously about when syphilis actually first arrived in Europe, we start to see and read discussions about the disease in the 1490s, when French armies brought it to Naples during an invasion. So in Italy, it was actually known at the time as the French disease. However, when those soldiers went back to France, in France, it was called the Neapolitan disease. For whatever reason, the French association really stuck. So even through the 18th century, people continued to refer to it as the French disease or the French pox. When it first appeared, illustrated pamphlets were published in an attempt to explain the symptoms and the causes of the disease, which, as you can see here, cause sores on the body, first at the site of infection and then in other parts of the body. In the pamphlet here illustrated by Dürer, a writer argues that syphilis is caused by bad air resulting from an unusual planetary conjunction. Within the next century, people had started to make a connection between the disease and sexual activity. Courtesans were viewed as vectors for transmission, leading to moralizing imagery like the one here by Jan Sadler. The message here, however, is not so immediately discernible and takes a little bit of reading, both the image and the text. As a young shepherd drinks from a stream of ostensibly fresh water on the right, an older figure warns him to consider otherwise. He points to a statue of Venus, the goddess of love, who springs water forth from her breasts. But this water passes beneath the dress of a well-attired Venetian courtesan. And then a dog relieves himself into that very same stream. If the message of the image was too subtle for readers, the printmaker also inscribed several excerpts from the Bible that condemn lust and sex outside of the confines of marriage. Syphilis continued to be associated with prostitutes and other so-called fallen women for centuries. The so-called French pox drives the plot in one of William Hogarth's most famous series, The Harlot's Progress, which was published in 1732 in London. Originally conceived as a group of 6 paintings, Hogarth later translated the compositions to a set of 6 engravings for wider public distribution. The engravings tell the story of a protagonist known only as M. Hackabout, who arrives in London for honest work and then falls into a life of disrepute. In the first image, M has freshly arrived to London, likely in search of a job as a seamstress, when an older brothel madam praises her beauty and suggests a more profitable occupation. This other profession is alluded to by the unsavory gentleman in the background with his hand suggestively placed in his pocket. If we compare, If we compare the faces of M and the madam, you'll notice several spots on the madam's face. These black patches were a popular way to cover blemishes and scars left behind by both smallpox and syphilis. While it was sometimes fashionable to have a single black spot, or a mouche as they were called, on one's face, they appear more frequently on prostitutes in the work of Hogarth. Through the rest of the prints, we trace M's shift in status from being a kept woman for a wealthy merchant to a prostitute living in a brothel. On the left, we see her surrounded by the trappings of her lover's wealth, including fine furniture, art, and even an enslaved youth on the lower right. On the right side, we see her new position is signaled by the shabbier interior, the line of suitors out the door, and a cat rearing its hindquarters on the floor. The cat here. Scholars have suggested that 2 small bottles of medicine above her headboard suggest that she's already being treated for syphilis at this point. The bottles are up here, a little bit hard to see there. We can also detect that the maid has congenital syphilis based on her wide-set eyes and the collapsing of the cartilage in her nose. The maid's condition is easier to see in the following image, where M has been arrested and sent to beat hemp in a workhouse as punishment. M ultimately succumbs to her illness as 2 doctors argue over her treatment. Her landlady steals her belongings, and her child plays innocently by the fire. In the final scene, M has died, and the other women at the brothel mourn, so to speak, her by drinking on top of her coffin. Off to the side, one of them admires herself in the mirror. You can see that up here. Outside the mirror, the woman caresses her hair, but in her reflection, she touches her face, which ominously has a developing sore on her forehead. On the left, I've included another detail where you can see the maid's features from a frontal view. Hogarth's Harlot's Progress is one of many works that stigmatize people with syphilis, particularly women and sex workers, which is something that continued through public health campaigns throughout the 20th century. So this wood engraving might strike you as something that would have been made in the Renaissance, thanks to the presence of our now familiar friend, death. But this was actually made in 1852 in response to cholera. Cholera first appeared in London and Paris in the early 1830s. Years later, the German artist Alfred Rachel read an account of a Parisian masquerade party that was struck by cholera. While the guests were celebrating, a number of people suddenly felt ill and were rushed to the hospital. By nightfall, they were all dead. Here, Rachel shows death as an uninvited guest, playing the fiddle as bodies collapse around him and others flee. In the background, cholera another uninvited guest, is personified as an Egyptian mummy in a burial shroud. While Rachel's wood engraving lightly exaggerates the original account, it is true that cholera claimed its victims with terrifying swiftness. After drinking contaminated water, this intestinal infection would result in drastic loss of body fluids, leading to kidney or heart failure within 24 hours. The last medical condition we'll look at today is one that's probably most familiar to everyone here. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, is a chronic, potentially life-threatening condition caused by the human immunodeficiency virus. By damaging your immune system, HIV interferes with the body's ability to fight infection and disease. The Davis has a rich and diverse collection of work related to the global AIDS epidemic. Many of these were created as a call to collective action for empathy, education, and public policy for people living with HIV and AIDS. For example, the poster on the left was created by queer street artist Keith Haring with the organization ACT UP. ACT UP organized protests and demonstrations known as die-ins to bring greater attention to the illness and specifically call on the US government to devote more financial resources to researching treatments and supporting people with HIV/AIDS. As an illness that was disproportionately affected the queer community, AIDS was heavily stigmatized and even unacknowledged by the highest offices of the US government. On the right, Masami Teraoka's Ghost Cat and Condom revives the style of Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints to bring awareness to the epidemic and the steps that can be taken to mitigate its spread. Other works in our collection focus on the experience of living with and being treated for AIDS as part of an effort to humanize people who would have otherwise been stigmatized in the media. British artist Sue Coe visited an AIDS clinic in Galveston, Texas, to draw patients. While she was there, she was especially interested to document the compassion with which doctors treated the people they cared for. And you can see here in the image on the left, depicting a doctor treating a patient with Kaposi sarcoma, the way that he touches the patient without any sense of fear. We also have a group of works from South Africa that were acquired or commissioned for the 2002 exhibition held at the Davis Museum to coincide with the international conference, AIDS in South Africa, the Social Expression of a Pandemic. This conference was organized by Wellesley economics professors Kyle Kaufman and David Lindauer. For the exhibition, artists were invited to create works about their experiences of the epidemic, which was the greatest medical, social, and economic crisis facing South Africa. The painting shown here addresses one of the populations that was especially at risk, the migrant miners. Describing his motivations for making this mixed media piece, the artist stated, quote, "Miners from rural areas are away from their families. They get involved in other relationships for the better part of their adult lives. Prostitutes' business is booming around the mines. And since most of the miners are semi-literate, it's very important that information about HIV and AIDS reach them in different formats," close quote. For this work, Cape Town-based artist Sue Williamson asked a man named Benjamin what he would like to tell the world about his experience as he lived out his final days. After taking this photograph, she hired a street artist to write his declaration, which reads, quote, "I'm sick of Mbeki saying HIV doesn't cause AIDS," close quote. This refers to the AIDS denialism of South African President Thabo Mbeki. Refusing to acknowledge that AIDS was caused by the HIV virus, he thwarted efforts to make antiretroviral drugs available to his citizens. This had a devastating effect on South Africa. In the year that Williamson made this photograph, 2000, the country lost as many as 1,000 people per day from AIDS-related illnesses. I'm now going to turn the virtual podium over to Dina to discuss our final image for today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dina, and I will be talking about David Goldblatt's photo featuring housekeeper Victoria Kobokana and her two children, Safiso and Onika. First, I'll start with a little bit of background information about Goldblatt. David Goldblatt was born in 1930 in Randfontein, a mining town close to the capital city of Johannesburg, South Africa. Growing up in apartheid South Africa, he was able to see many racial disparities around him. Many Black South Africans lived outside of Johannesburg in the Soweto township. However, they would commute into the city to work as manual laborers or domestic workers for white families. Black South Africans used a card called a dampa, which was necessary for entry into the city. As a teenager, Goldblatt's family employed a domestic worker whose dampa he had to sign each afternoon so that she could enter the city the next morning. Due to his proximity to economic and racial inequality, many of his photographs focus on low-income and Black South Africans. Goldblatt wanted to raise awareness about how the effects of apartheid influenced the conditions in which marginalized people lived, without focusing on scenes of violence that were more common in the media. Here we can see a couple of his photos capturing the Black South African experience. In the photo on the left, two men can be seen holding their dampas, and in the photo on the right, a domestic worker carries her employer's laundry through the city on her head. Later in his life, Goldblatt began to focus on the effects of the AIDS epidemic in South Africa. In this photograph, we can see two of Goldblatt's main themes converging. His main subject is Victoria, a housekeeper from Soweto. She is pictured here with her two young children. The three of them sit in the middle of a house filled with priceless art and artifacts, which reflect the wealth of its owners. While we may initially think that the house is Victoria's, the broom leaning on the left side of the photograph, as well as the grubbiness of the children's clothes, let us know that she is the homeowner's housekeeper. These contrasting elements demonstrate the long-standing racial and economic disparities within the country. In this composition, Goldblatt also draws from iconographical precedents, comparing the Kobokana family to the figures of Mary, Jesus, and Saint John the Baptist. If we look to the right, we can see Matteo de Giovanni's Madonna and Child with Saint John the Baptist. The Virgin Mary sits in the center of the painting with a halo surrounding her head. The baby Jesus sits in her lap while a young John the Baptist stands at her side. This arrangement is replicated by the Kobokana family in several ways. Victoria's face is framed by a window behind her head. Looking out onto a sunny sky, the circular window creates a halo of sorts. Its round shape is echoed in the crown-like chandelier that suspends from the ceiling. Her two children also mimic the poses of the Christ child and young John the Baptist. One sits in her lap while the other sits by her side, or stands by her side, sorry. The iconographical similarities between the photo and the painting are perhaps a premonition of the Kobokana's family's deaths, again drawing influence from images of the Virgin and the Child that foreshadow Jesus's death. In the Bible, Jesus sacrifices himself for the forgiveness of human sin. He lives his entire life with the knowledge that he will die. Though it is unclear from the biblical text whether the Virgin Mary knows that Jesus will die, painters often portrayed her with a somber smile on her face to suggest her future loss. We can also see this smile mirrored on Victoria's face. When this photo was taken, Victoria likely did know that she would die from AIDS-related complications and that her children would too. In 1998, just a year before Goldblatt took this photograph, researchers discovered that 34% of pregnant women transmit the HIV virus in the last stage of pregnancy and through breastfeeding. Although the drug nevirapine was approved for use in the US in 1996, and in Europe in 1997 to prevent mother-to-child transmission, the South African government resisted making it accessible to its own citizens. From the photographer's full caption, we know that the family died shortly after this photo was taken. It reads, Victoria Kobokana, housekeeper, in her employer's dining room with her son Sifiso and daughter Onika, Johannesburg, June 1999. Victoria died of AIDS on the 13th of December 1999. Sifiso died of AIDS on the 12th of January 2000. Onika died of AIDS in May 2000. In contrast to Matteo De Giovanni's painting, the foreshadowing of death in Goldblatt's photograph does not signify a willing sacrifice, nor does this death serve a greater purpose. Their deaths were the result of governmental neglect rather than martyrdom, and the lives of the children were cut short due to insufficient public health resources. Even though the family were not martyrs, the halos serve as a memorial, symbolically honoring the family's death by likening them to angels. The photograph itself also memorializes the family in history, giving their full names and causes of death, yet also capturing them when they still looked healthy. In conclusion, Goldblatt's international platform drew attention to the injustices that allowed these tragic deaths to happen, helping to bring justice to the people of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. I also want to thank everybody for listening to us today. We'd be delighted to take any questions either about the works that we talked about today or about the collections at the Davis or what we've been up to at the Davis for the past year. Thank you.
If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we can ask them to Heather and Dina.
While we're waiting, I also wanted to point out that those of you who missed the Davis and would love to see what we're up to there, we have created a number of virtual exhibitions over the past year that especially speak to some of the things we talked about today. So for instance, thank you, Mary, right? So I'll put a link here in the chat to our virtual platform. Our curator, assistant curator, Nicole Berlin, created a virtual exhibition about the Antioch mosaics. So I know many people remember the mosaics fondly. If you follow the link there, you can tell us about the, you can see the mosaics and see some archival footage of them actually being excavated. There is also on that page an exhibition called Hidden Histories, revealing the life of a painting. And that exhibition talks about the history of the donor portrait that I showed in the beginning, showing the Holy Family with Saint Sebastian and Saint Catherine. There's actually a debate over who the artist is, because there are 5 copies of this painting with different donors in it, and we don't know which one is the original. There's one in the Louvre, and then we have one, and so this is an exhibition kind of trying to untangle that mystery. The final thing that I want to share with you all is we actually created 3D scans of the galleries, and you can see the permanent collections as well as the exhibitions that were up last spring when we had the 3D scanner made. So you can, I'll send that link. I'll mention that if you open it right now, it might slow down your Zoom. So please take a look at it later and go visit your favorite works in the permanent collection. Okay, so now I see that while I've been doing that, I see that the chat has been active. So Emily.
It has, yes. There are quite a few questions on a similar theme, which is, are you seeing artwork starting to depict COVID-19 and what's happening in the current pandemic?
So there has been, we have been trying to keep a good eye on art that's being created in the past year in response to the epidemic, or the pandemic, I guess at this point. What's been really fascinating to see is artists creating work that doesn't necessarily depict the kind of what I talked about with the plague, that they're not necessarily always only depicting people who have COVID or the physical embodiment of the disease or the illness, but what life is like under the conditions of lockdown. So I'm thinking, for example, early on, maybe in like spring, early summer last year, the New York Times had a really great piece on photographers who have been taking on new themes and new subjects, working from home, whether they were turning to everyday objects in their houses, going out into nature, taking really focused looks at the textures of things that were just in their everyday space that they inhabited, to kind of taking a new, fresh look at things that they had taken for granted before. So we'll be interested to think about how the psychology of the pandemic has really yielded some interesting approaches to art, rather than only about, what it's been like to experience the illness itself. But if you've seen any good art that you think that we should be acquiring, please let me know.
Yes, and someone did point out that there's also been a lot of like writing about COVID as well, like poems and things that, and published works.
I know Zadie Smith, I think, put out a book just within months of what it's like to live in lockdown. She wrote and published a whole book of short essays.
Here's a question about the artwork about the plague. It says, what would you say are the key themes plague response art convey? Fear, humanization, and education, or are there others?
Oh, what can you say those themes again? Oh, I see it in the chat. Fear, humanization, education, others. I would say that humanization is a big one that I have seen. Is there's so much about Sebastian really out there, of treating him, and part of that had to do with encouraging the people who took care of plague victims to see themselves as agents of God, to see, so for example, people with the plague were often treated in religious institutions. And so, having people look at images of Irene, Saint Irene, who has been now sort of canonized and seen as someone who has become selfless in the face of taking care of somebody who has this contagious disease. And, they didn't fully understand the mechanics of the contagion at the time, but they could determine that there was some kind of transmission happening between people. And so to see these images that show that you should not fear this, that you should, still be a good Christian and help those who were ill, is a frequent theme that comes up.
There's another question about the plague. Are there any works of ancient works like Greece, Rome, Egypt that depict plague?
I'm not sure. I would think that there were. So the 6th century plague is known as the plague of Justinian. It's not my area of expertise. I would love to know. I didn't come across anything when I was preparing the talk, but it's possible that there were some. And one thing I also want to mention is, I recognize that this talk was very European and American centric, and that there are things that are made, especially in response to other infectious diseases. So one thing that I'd love to look more closely at is whether we have things that speak to smallpox or even syphilis, especially in the Ancient Americas collection, that perhaps, I wasn't able to recognize in my, from my area of expertise, and also not being able to be in the museum right now. But it's possible that there are some other things there within our collection of 15,000 works that betray clues that are not immediately discernible, especially in our database. So I'm going to continue to keep an eye out and look for other things in the collection that speak to either these older epidemics or responses from different cultures. Thank you for that question.
There's another question that asked if you would have a list of the pieces that you showed during the presentation so that people could look them up.
I'm thinking about how I could make that available.
That's probably something you could share with the Alumni Association, and we can make sure to share it out. Yeah.
Sure. So there's that. And also we do have an online database. So once you do, I'm going to find that link really quickly right now. If you were writing anything down and you want to see it again, here's the link to our collection database. It's a direct link, and you can get to that just from our homepage as well. So we have our, basically everything in our collection is on our database, except if we just acquired it in the past 6 months or so.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. Are there cultural differences in how different countries in Europe discussed and portrayed the disease?
Which one?
I'm assuming that they're saying plague, but I'm not positive.
Differences between
How they,
different- oh.
how countries in Europe discussed and portrayed, like perhaps in,
Mhm. Like France versus Italy.
yeah, I think that's
Um,
what she's asking.
Yeah. So the issue of one distinction that I think that we see is between the Protestant countries and the Catholic countries, so that you would be less likely to see images of Saint Sebastian in the north. So for example, in the Netherlands or in England even. One thing I'd love to see is there was an outbreak of the plague in the 17th century in London, and we don't really have a strong collection of, well, few American museums have strong collections of 17th century English art. So that's in England, but I'd love to see how they responded to the plague after centuries of it happening over and over again. But the images of the saints, I didn't come across it as much in the north. So those memento mori images, I only showed a couple of those, but those are they're much more common in Germany and in the Netherlands, so in Dutch and Flemish art. So those when I'm thinking about it now, those are countries that were more Protestant, and so that move away from the saintly imagery could be a way that they were processing the idea of death being everywhere, is to have these images of death kind of always showing up unannounced and interrupting people's lives. And I actually, I'll share my screen just for a quick second, because I did bring another image about that. Those of you who noticed this, might have found it familiar to see those images of death. A lot of the most famous series of that is Hans Holbein, The Younger's Dance of Death, which is a suite of a number of images published together in a book of death showing up to people's homes, to their workplaces, and basically interrupting them and claiming them. And so one of the things that's really important about that series is that he goes to, he visits people of different social ranks. He visits the emperor, he visits the pope, he visits a farmer, he visits a sailor. And he's actually more violent when he attacks people who are wealthy and powerful, kind of to almost wrest them from their sense of safety and comfort, thinking that they might be above all of that. So there are lots of images of death like that. Death in quotes.
I think this is a question that's more aimed at sort of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the current pandemic. Do you see mass media ads, TV and print as forms of art, especially related to spreading public awareness of disease?
Yes, in a sense, I do. I'm a specialist in print culture in particular, which was is great to work on this topic, because there's so much about these issues that intersect with social causes, whether in the Renaissance art or now. You often see in whatever form of mass media is available to a culture, whatever can meet the highest number of people in the most accessible way, is often where you see this kind of response to a big social trauma like disease. And so you saw that in the Renaissance and with AIDS in particular. So I don't think it's an accident that Herring made that. So Herring was a street artist traditionally, and he did make some paintings once he got gallery representation, and still made quote one of a kind works. But he continued to be very committed to making things that were going to get out the message about AIDS. Like, he saw his art and his activism as being very intertwined. And so being a street artist, someone who made, publicly available street art, and which back then, by the way, was not necessarily seen as art the way, we think of Banksy now as art, right? Even the name street art back then, it was graffiti. So, opinions certainly change on like when we kind of embrace these things as art or collectible. I know right now I recently went to a lecture given by curators at the Smithsonian American Museum on an exhibition on Latinx art. They're beginning to collect digital files of digital art that is made right now. They're collecting the sort of like the digital files and JPEGs as part of their collection, because a lot of the political art that's coming out right now are in these ephemeral formats that are meant to be used on social media to get them kind of to greater audiences.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. What other diseases were women, minorities, etc., blamed for plagues and diseases, and how were the blamed people portrayed?
Oh, good question. First of all, I'm glad that you picked up that there are certain groups that are frequently stigmatized, especially marginalized groups. Gonorrhea is another one. Dina and I have been working to do some research on this subject for maybe a future project about the intersection of art and medicine. And there are some posters that were made, especially during World War II. Was it World War II, Dina? Yeah, World War II, as part of a public health campaign to warn sailors and servicemen to avoid foreign women because they were insidious, sneaky women who were carrying syphilis and gonorrhea and chlamydia and everything like that. And so they always show these women as, oh, there's one great one where a woman, she's really like beautiful and made up with makeup and a fashionable outfit from the front. And in the back, she's a skeleton. So again, bringing back that old imagery of death and kind of showing, and the fact that it's the skeleton in the back is like she's hiding something, right? So the idea that people are keeping their status, secret. I think if there's other illnesses.
That could also relate to the last question, where like even the government produces art in some capacity, even if it's like flyers or propaganda for warning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the government is, even in its public health campaigns meant to help people, is can contribute to the stigma. So
okay, I've got one more. Then I think this will be the last one.
They're great questions.
Yeah. And there's a lot of comments just saying wonderful lecture and thank you very much. So this one says that she would be interested to learn if there was art inspired by the yellow fever plagues in New Orleans during the 19th century. Don't know if you would know that, but ask it to you anyway.
I don't know. There must be. I'm trying to keep an eye out for all kinds of things. So I didn't come across anything on the 1918 flu pandemic in our collection, which was shocking because this year we've been hearing about how comparable this pandemic was to that one. We didn't have anything on this huge thing. There are some paintings and things out there in the world that exist, but I really didn't find anything on that in the flu. And smallpox was a hard one, but I know that there are things out there, especially if you're looking at Indigenous art, First Nations art. Still thinking about how we can add to the Davis collection to fill in these gaps that have to do with art and medicine. So, if anyone thinks of other things or is aware of them, not that are available, but if you just think I'd be interested, feel free to email Dina and I, because we've really enjoyed working on this topic. Thank you all for all these really great questions.